So welcome to another episode of Parallax. Good afternoon and welcome to Ms. Trisha Ray, the Associate Fellow at ORF in the Cyber Initiative and Media and Technology Program. Thank you for coming here today. As you know, IPCS along with the Hans Title Stiftung India is organizing a series of videos on the India-EU Strategic Partnership, which we are calling the India-EU Series. And in this particular conversation, we're going to be focusing on technology cooperation, and of course, that's where your expertise comes in. Today's discussion is going to be split into three parts. We're going to be looking at general conversation on ICT, which is Information Communications Technology, and of course 5G, and then artificial intelligence. But before we get into these three separate segments within the technology sector, what I would actually wanted to begin with is your assessment or your view of the values and interests of India-EU strategic partnership in technology when it comes to the strategic competition between the US and China.
So India and EU have a lot by way of shared interests and values in tech cooperation. One of these being the desire to set up alternatives to these big tech giants that have so far dominated the digital and data economies, primarily based in the US and China. And so you see these stories coming out of these growth stories coming out of India and EU that focus on supporting local alternatives to these platforms to take back control from these tech giants. This can also, for example, manifest in sovereignty narratives such as cyber sovereignty, data sovereignty, terms which until recently the EU was a little shy to embrace, but you see that having wider purchase now. And recently, with the release of the Data Governance Act, in fact, the language of European data must remain within Europe was pretty explicitly mentioned. So there's a lot going on that there's more convergence between the EU and India now than there ever was before. You also see a lot happening, for instance, in the AI space, where the focus on equitable, inclusive AI governance regimes has manifest in the GPA, the Global Partnership on AI, of which EU and India are members. There's a lot going on there. Of course, there's still a fair bit of daylight between the two on certain issues, cybersecurity being one, and India's refusal to sign on to the Budapest Convention being another. But yes, there's plenty going on there.
Actually, I find the discussion on these convergent interests sort of vague at times, right? It's always very easy for us to couple the India and the EU as one group because of certain historical convergences, and then to say that if this group wants to make a third path between the US and China. But I was wondering specifically if there were any sort of maybe one or two specific values, like for example, in the roadmap to 2025, there's a mention of human-centric digitalization and a number of other terms that the India and the EU share. So I was wondering if maybe you could shine a light on what those values actually are. Like you said, cyber sovereignty and so on. What do you think they mean and what they are?
So yeah, in the EU framework, it's human-centric digital transformation. In India, we've seen that in language such as AI for all, tech for all, right. India's $1 trillion opportunity, and so on. And they're similar, but the focus is still slightly different. Because from my reading, the EU framework is, of course, about fair, equitable, transparent, accountable tech, but also it's more individual focus. Whereas in India, it's about economic upliftment, about inclusive transformation, and has a more governance and community focus. So right. While on the surface area, there is a shared value, but the focus of that value is fairly different.
Okay. Then in that case, what we could do is possibly have a look at what in your opinion is the track record of the existing partnership instruments between India and the EU. Most notably, more notable of which is the ICT standardization policy and legislation project. I was wondering if you have been keeping track of what the performance has been of this project and what the implications are in possibly the next 4 years of strengthening this sort of bilateral engagement on ICT in particular.
Hmm. Again, so the thing is with EU and India, when it comes to ICT cooperation, a lot of it right now is very much in the nascent stages, primarily because the two geographies are in very different stages of their ICT development
Right.
story. So India, most of its current partnerships with the EU is a lot about infrastructure development. And so connectivity is the big issue that India is really trying to fix right now. And so, yeah, I think that would be in the next 4 years, the
That should be
primary
the
area of focus.
focus.
Yes, exactly. Because we may be jumping the gun when we come to, when we say that, okay, by 2025, we'll have an X billion digital economy. There's a lot that still needs to be done for us to really get there. Yeah. And then another area of growing focus is going to be data governance, which again, you see more convergence between EU and India, especially in terms of language there. Especially in the idea of holding intermediaries and platforms accountable. And so, for instance, it would be interesting to see what the EU's Digital Services Act, which I believe is supposed to release in a few weeks, what that turns out looking like.
Since we are already talking about endogenous factors that affect the India-EU relationship, I was wondering what do you think the post-pandemic trends for India's high-tech manufacturing sector, infrastructure for that matter, what those trends will be in the next in the post-pandemic era, whenever that ends, because the pre-pandemic predictors and predictions and trends for the Indian domestic high-tech market, ESDM, is very, very very positive, incredibly positive, in fact, when you compare it to what's going on today. So I was wondering what you think the trends are going to be, and what segments within the technology sector should India really focus and increase its capacity in order to actually fructify this relationship with the EU.
Yeah, so you're right. Pre-pandemic, there was a lot of optimism about India's space in the ESDM sector. And in fact, I believe a year or two ago, it was nearly 3% of India's GDP. The issue really is that even though it's a growing sector, India's place in the tech value chain is not particularly high. So where we need to focus in the coming decade is on developing design capabilities, high-tech applications, not just, assembly and like basic manufacturing. And so while there does seem to be intent, at least from the government side, on incentivizing and investing in such capabilities, notably we had this year and last year a focus on semiconductors and quantum computing in the Indian budgets. But having seen the track record of similar initiatives in the past, perhaps the government needs to take a step back and really let the private sector step in.
On the private sector, then I'd like to ask you what you think are the sort of barriers to trade that the EU keeps complaining about when it comes to setting up manufacturing in India. Of course, over the last so many years, this same government has decided to open up FDIs, 100% FDIs in certain segments within the tech sector. And I was wondering if these sort of barriers to trade that the EU has been complaining about has been addressed in the last 4 to 5 years, and will they be addressed in the next coming years?
Yes, there is at times an odd contradiction between the narrative of India moving towards a more business friendly environment. And yes, we've been climbing up ranks and lists in that front. And then on the flip side, there is also a narrative of protectionism that has been on the rise. And that is primarily based on this, how do I put it, this tech nationalism,
Mm-hmm.
which is where the development of tech has become so linked to national identity that you see all these offset effects rising as a result of that. And so this contradiction is something that I understand why partner countries might find this frustrating, but ultimately this is not just an India phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
Most countries are going through the same sets of issues. This uh, a retreat in globalization, a
Right.
rise in regionalization, and the focus on domestic capacity, indigenization, and so on.
Uh, in fact, I actually just today I was watching a Washington Post video on the slow shift of manufacturing facilities from China into India. Of course, most of the manufacturing facilities have found their way into Southeast Asia, but the examples usually cited are Foxconn and Samsung, right? The but at the same time, there is while there is this shift and there is the desire amongst India and its IPR partners, like the Indo-Pacific partners, to sort of move away or detach from the Chinese economy, there still seems to be a material dependence on the same traditional partners, right? The US, the UK, and China, when it comes to certain technologies. And I really wonder how the EU then will aid India in achieving what you have termed the sort of tech nationalism. Both ways, of course. It's a little weird to say nationalism will help both sides of the story, but you know, where do you see the EU actually guiding India materially in this sort of new technology?
Mm. Mm, so the bulk of EU-India partnership work has been in EU investment in research initiatives in India. Horizon 2020 was an example of some of these initiatives. And the second set of, this is not material, is in norms building, where you have a lot of conversations going on again, shared values. We're going to have norms for cyberspace. There's talk of perhaps India adopting some elements of the EU cyber diplomacy toolbox and so on. EU's value ultimately is in its value setting work. And an example of that is GDPR, which has served as a precedent for many similar data governance regulations around the world. I wouldn't say that we'd necessarily require X billion dollars to go from EU to India for it to be any sort of productive partnership.
Okay. Then in that case, before we move into sort of the 5G and AI topics, I found it very interesting that the roadmap to 2025 and the joint statement thereafter, after the 15th summit, mentioned extending, the progress and the fruits of India-EU technological cooperation to third-party countries, right? And the obvious, arena remains Southeast Asia in the Indo-Pacific discourse. Even though technology is now part of the global competition, it's still very much within this sort of Indo-Pacific theater. And now that we've already gone through the tech nationalism, protectionism, recent changes to the economic dynamic in Southeast Asia, I was just thinking, which countries do you see as viable third-party countries in technology cooperation to India and the EU in Southeast Asia?
Mm. Mm. So with Southeast Asia, I think that India has a lot more purchase than many of these bigger countries because we're in a similar space developmentally, infrastructurally, tech-wise, being stuck between China and US and so on. And so Singapore, for instance, has always been a very vocal advocate for ICT-led development. That's one of the obvious partners.
Mm-hmm.
Then Vietnam has is also, say, in a similar space as India in that um, they face similar challenges. They're also trying to figure out what to do in the data governance space and in really balancing, maybe less so now because India has made its stance on China and tech pretty clear, but prior to this, uh, there's a general Southeast Asia sentiment of wanting to benefit from both sets of relationships
Mm-hmm.
and not having to choose, and that's something that India historically has sympathized with.
Okay. All right. Then on 5G, and I will be very honest. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a generalist. I don't know much about the specifics of these technologies. So for me, this exercise has also been very eye-opening. I've learned a lot about 5G, things that I've never known before: drivers, cores, this and that. But I have also read that the pandemic has had like an actual direct impact on the way that 5G will be rolled out around the world. And I was wondering if you could explain what that impact is and how that will affect the India-EU strategic partnership.
So the first most obvious way in which the pandemic has affected 5G rollouts is delays. India was supposed to, for example, have or start 5G trials beginning of this year. This was after it had already been postponed once. Now we don't know when it's actually going to happen. This has been the case with many countries around the world, in Southeast Asia, in Europe, and so on. That's one way in which the
Pandemic.
yeah the way in which 5G rollouts have been affected. The second set of issues that has become more pronounced during the pandemic is uh, this realization that China is not going to be a reliable partner.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is just the damage they did to their own relationship with countries by pushing misinformation and misleading narratives and sending simple things like sending defective PPE that has really eroded the trust many countries would have had on China. And that has had bleed off effects into how these countries perceive Chinese vendors. And so you've seen in most of Europe and India the fact that the China hawk side of most of these governments have been strengthened, also based on general public souring
Right.
of public opinion on China. So these two, I think, would be the two biggest factors, the two biggest effects coming out
Of
of
the
the
pandemic.
pandemic on
And could you like possibly just touch upon how this the differences in, like, for example, there is this standalone model of a rollout and a non-standalone model of a 5G rollout, right? And there is clear distinction between the Indian model and the EU's model. And on top of these differences of infrastructure, establishment, implementation, you also have differences in capacity and the pandemic itself. So I was just wondering, 5G specifically, once again, how uh, where will how will the India-EU partnership actually take this forward? Achieve the sort of equitable decimation of technology, so on and so forth, in their own countries.
Yeah, again, EU and India are in such different places when it comes to infrastructure, and that ties back to the standalone, non-standalone models of rollout. In India, we don't even have the capacity to do
Non-standard.
standalone rollouts. Most of the country doesn't even have 4G yet, and so we're in different places right now. Where India and EU could cooperate is that both blocks have or are developing indigenous 5G hardware and capabilities.
Mhm.
We already have two vendors, Nokia and Ericsson, in Europe, and then Jio in India is partnering with Qualcomm and other vendors to develop its own capacity. So investment in terms of know-how, in terms of technical capabilities, in what in India's fledgling 5G sector would certainly be one way in which the two could cooperate. And this would serve EU interests as well, because again, they're also looking for alternatives. You don't want the ban on Chinese 5G equipment to turn into a Nokia Ericsson duopoly. So
Right.
having multiple players is always helpful in such a market.
On 5G again, there's enough and more, the different sort of studies on which specific sectors within India would first benefit and best benefit from, the integration of 5G technologies. There is the number one even mentioned when it comes to 5G and even for AI is agriculture. So that as an example, I was wondering if you could give me possibly what you think are the top three priority sectors in which India should ensure that there's effective 5G rollout and integration into that particular sector.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that there is plenty of promise in a bunch of sectors, agriculture being one. But um, the first sector in which I think we'll really see any movement on 5G would be just uh, mobile subscriptions.
Right.
And it's the first set of 5G rollouts are going to be a very urban phenomenon, and you're going to see most of it being consumer and content focused. Then we'll move on to industrial applications. So in manufacturing, we'll have IoT applications being supported by 5G. And then as we move from tier one, tier two, tier three cities on um, to the rural part of India, that's when uh, 5G applications will really make their way there. It's not going to be like we start rolling out in 2021, 2022. The entire country is going to have 5G and we're going to have smart agriculture. It's going to be really baby steps. So it's going to start with consumer focused tech, moving on to manufacturing tech, and really that it will trickle down finally to agriculture.
Okay. Now moving to AI, in my research for our session today, I found the Solve in India model and the Make in Europe model, shared one by India and the EU. I was wondering if you could explain where these two, as in a discussion earlier about values and interests, where you just read these terms, one might feel that there is some sort of a conflict between these two sort of plans. I was wondering if you could help navigate the ambitions and goals of either and see where they converge and diverge. So, Solved in India and Make in Europe.
Mm-hmm. The Make in Europe, or at least in the words of the Europeans themselves, it's not just about we want to prop up our European tech entities. It's about finding good alternatives to existing US, Chinese, or other dominant actors in this sphere. In India, it's about developing indigenous solutions to indigenous problems because our problems are fairly unique. Uh, and that is really where I think Solve in India has its merit. Uh, let's see. What we may see in terms of convergence between the two, would be that, I mean, they have similar goals, but there will be some conflict in
Right.
terms of each set wanting entry into the other's markets and not finding that even if our end goals are similar.
Right.
That's where the existing dialogues, cyber dialogues that have been going on since 2011, and additional ICT dialogues that have been going on for several years now, that's really where the two will need to work these issues out.
Uh, Even still on AI, I was wondering if you could point to the sort of key advantages that India has in the academic, arena, in the R&D and innovation space. Uh, how has Indian AI actually changed over the last 8 years? And I would also like to know, and obviously in asking this, I would like to know how we have come now to this solved in India ambition. What has actually changed at home for us to make this sort of plan that we want to, solve 30% of the world's, ex-China 30% of the world's AI problems in India.
Hmm. Hmm. So India has always been a bit of a dark horse in the so-called AI race. So we have the standard line of we have STEM talent, we have data, um, and that has underpinned India's AI story for years now. But you also see that now picking up with a greater number of widely cited research papers coming out of India. That is always a good sign. And a growing number of startups in this space.
Mm.
And you also saw a bit of a boom in the India tech startup space almost as a direct result of the ban on Chinese apps, for example,
Right.
because you now had to find
So,
Indian solutions or Indian alternatives to these well-established apps that had existed so far. And so, yeah, there's progress. There's also been a good volume of investment coming in to all of these startups from US, from China until recently, and from Europe as well. There's been a good amount of growth in terms of capacity, in terms of research, in terms of talent in AI. We still have a ways to go. And while there has been progress in the development of AI talent within the country with the setting up of AI centers of excellence and hackathons and so on, uh, the demand for AI talent versus the supply is still a problem that really needs to be fixed.
okay. The India-EU partnership makes use of a lot of new terms, right? And the most important ones in my mind are the resource efficiency, sustainable modernization, and equitable growth. And obviously the use of the term human-centered digitalization. And I was just wondering if you could sort of map out where these particular technologies, ICT, 5G, AI, what role do they play in achieving these sort of, fanciful terms?
Okay. Yeah. So in both India and EU, there's been this sense of urgency almost on trying to make the most of the coming fourth industrial revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And in both geographies, then there's been this flurry of AI strategies on 5G strategies that seek to really take these two geographies into this new decade in a way where they're able to reap the benefits of these technologies in a way that is balanced, is equitable, is inclusive, and that's been really the driving force when it comes to these emerging technologies in policymaking spaces in EU and in India. And there's this belief that with greater access, you can solve a lot of issues that have held back um, vulnerable communities so far. The belief that an access to a device can open up a whole world of work opportunities. Access to the internet can enable communities that have been left behind in previous industrial revolutions to um, find work that is fulfilling and productive, and in and to be able to do so in a way that um, doesn't end up harming communities. And so, for example, future of work is also a fairly underexplored area when it comes to India-EU cooperation, because that's also been a focus for the two of them.
So before we end, then, Ms. Ray, I'd like to ask you for three specific policy recommendations that you would like to give to better improve the India-EU strategic partnership in technology, of course.
Yep. The first would be that I would like to see a concrete set of principles coming out of India, EU, and the other countries that are part of the global partnership on AI. And there has been some positive movement there. I know that they're doing a mapping exercise of principles, AI principles at the moment, for example. A second would be this prickly issue that still hasn't been resolved, even though there's been a lot of lip service that has been paid to it on both sides, and that is India signing on to, or at least harmonizing its own regulations with the Budapest Conventions. Because again, data sharing continues to be the most prickly issue when it comes to India, EU cyber issues and tech-related issues. And then the third is something that you mentioned yourself in the questions you sent me, is really figuring out how to move now beyond these lip service principles, these norms, to something more concrete when it comes to tech governance. And you'll see as these conversations happen that while these principles, while we all espouse transparency, inclusivity, they also mean very different things to different communities and different nations. And so there really is a need to start condensing that dialogue into more concrete recommendations, into a toolbox that they can use.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Ray. As a beginner in this field, this was a great conversation because you connected a lot of the dots for me personally, and I'm sure even our listeners. And so I'd like to thank you on the behalf of IPCS HSS for taking part in our Parallax on technology. And I'd like to wish you a good day.
Thanks, Siddharth. It was great being part of this conversation as well.